The number 3 best chess game of the 1950s is Efim Geller vs. Max Euwe from Zurich 1953. This incredible interzonal tournament spawned not one, not two, but 3 truly classic chess books about the event. The first and most famous is by David Bronstein, and we will look at key passages today, but there was also a great book in Dutch by Euwe himself and a contribution by Miguel Najdorf. Now, this particular game won the brilliancy prize for this great tournament for Euwe's incredible counterattack, featuring possibly the greatest defensive chess sacrifice of all time. Geller opens the game here with pawn to d4, and Euwe elects to respond with the trusty Nimzo-Indian defense, pawn to e6 to meet knight c3 with bishop b4. Of course, the classic idea of the Nimzo-Indian defense is to give up the bishop for the knight on c3, wreck white's pawn structure, and produce a position in which the black knights might be superior to the white bishop pair. Now, white is going to respond with e3, the trusty Rubinstein variation of very good response, c5, and then an inaccuracy, pawn to a3. This move is the 5th most popular move in the position, and it is white's worst performing, relatively popular option. This move is basically giving up a tempo because black will often make the exchange on c3 unprovoked, so white spending a tempo on a3 simply loses that tempo. Also, after bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, this bishop might have wanted to go to a3 in some cases, and it will no longer be able to do that. Black, I think, is already equal, maybe even a little bit better because of the wasted move, pawn to a3. Now, b6, bishop d3, bishop to b7, and pawn to f3. White, of course, knows that the pawn structure on the queen side is a disaster. At some point, black will be able to target these pawns, probably win at least one pawn on c4, and break through. Geller's idea, though, is not to care about the loss of a pawn on the queen side and to build up a massive pawn storm on the king side, leading to a winning attack. It is a very fascinating conflict of ideas, just absolute steamrolling in the center of the board with an attacking position versus a positional approach that is slowly but surely breaking through on the queen side. Now, after pawn to f3, we see knight c6, knight to e2, castles, castles, knight a5. This pawn is starting to come under fire very, very quickly. It will not be defensible on the c4 square. Pawn to e4, meanwhile, white is getting rolling in the middle of the board, and the next move, knight to e8, is a very interesting and instructive idea that was first played by world chess champion Jose Capablanca, in not quite this position, but in a similar position. Here's what Bronstein has to say about this knight e8 move. Black retreats his knight to forestall the pin with 12 bishop g5, and to be able to answer pawn to f4 with pawn to f5, blockading the king's wing. White therefore secures f5 before advancing the f-pawn. It would be senseless to defend the pawn at c4 now. That pawn was doomed by white's 5th move. As foreshadowed by Bronstein, Geller now plays the move knight to g3. He adds another minor piece that controls this f5 square, preparing to push forward without allowing pawn to f5 in response by Euwe. Now, after knight g3, we see a trade here on d4, and then the rook is ready to go to the c-file to attack that pawn on c4. As indicated, this pawn is not defensible in the long term, and Geller has no intentions of defending the pawn. Now, at this point, the computer points out a more modern pawn sacrifice here that would have given better chances to Geller. That's the move pawn to c5, just saying, all right, I can't defend the c4 pawn, but let me give it up on my terms. After pawn takes, and rook takes c5, bishop d2 threatens a lot of things, including bishop to b4 winning an exchange. Knight c6 pulling the knight back from the rim and defending the b4 square makes sense, but after rook b1, white has the bishop pair in a position that is now open, and there's a lot of pressure on the queen side. The queen too will come into the action, and actually white has very good compensation for the pawn thanks to the activity over on the queen side. However, in the game, Geller is focused on his goal, the king side and the pawn storm. Therefore, he plays pawn to f4, allowing knight takes c4. He pushes forward again, pawn to f5. At this point, Euwe needs to defend, so he plays pawn to f6. This move stops the idea of pawn f6, knight takes, and bishop g5 with a ton of pressure on the king side and on what will be a pinned knight on f6. After the move pawn to f6, we see rook f4 committing to a rook lift over on the king side and a ferocious attack. At this point, Bronstein comments, "White's attack has become rather threatening. Black's previous move was necessary to forestall White's intention to push his pawn to f6, and then after knight takes f6 to pin the knight after all, piling up on the king with the combined firepower of queen, rooks, and 3 minor pieces. Even now, White needs only 2 moves to transfer his rook and queen to the h-file, and then it might appear that nothing could save the black king." However, then Bronstein comments, "Euwe is not easily flustered. Remember, in his lifetime he has played more than 70 games without Yekin, the most feared attacking player of our time." Euwe's next move is possibly his best move objectively in the entire game. With all of this firepower preparing to come at his king, he calmly plays the move b5. Now, yes, this move does defend and support the knight here on c4, but the bigger point is to activate the queen on d8, which has been a bystander, but now it can come to b6, attacking d4 and creating serious counterplay, possibly forking the king and the rook on a1. Now, after b5, Geller continues with his attacking ideas. Rook to h4, queen b6, attacking this pawn here on d4, and now e5. This is a beautiful move that combines defense and attack. It defends the pawn along the horizontal rank, but it also opens up this bishop, which is starting to eye the h7 pawn. Now, after e5, we see knight takes e5. Euwe is taking advantage of the pin here on the pawn on d4. The knight cannot be captured, and the knight is attacking this bishop here on d3. Pawn takes e6, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, pointing at h7, and now queen takes e6, recapturing the pawn and eliminating the attack on f7 that was created by the pawn on e6, so that the next move, queen takes h7 check, is not checkmate. Instead, the black king can run to f7. Now, after bishop h6 from Geller, this position is critical. White, for his part, has a lot of pieces massed around the obviously not very safe king on f7. There's the queen, bishop, rook, and knight, and it's very possible that maybe Geller's next move could be rook f1, which could add the final piece into the attack. There are all kinds of attacking ideas swirling, including bishop takes g7, maybe knight h5, and this other rook can swing over. However, at least for this moment, there is some disunity in the white camp. There is no obvious way to get at this king here on f7, and obviously this king is a little bit exposed down here on g1. On the other hand, how do you get there? This rook cannot invade on c2, you can't pick up the pawn on d4 or access the e3 square. Both of these squares are covered by the white queen and bishop. This is the perfect moment to pause your video and try to find Euwe's next incredible move. Well, that move is rook h8. It is no exaggeration to say that this is maybe the greatest defensive move, greatest defensive sacrifice of all time. It has dazzled generations. The rook is sacrificed to just temporarily create disunity in the white camp, breaking up the attack and invading. Bronstein comments, if Black's 16th move, b5, was the beginning of a strategic plan of counterattack, then this rook sacrifice is its fundamental tactical stroke, with the aim of drawing the white queen still further afield and decoying it away from the defense of the c2 square, meanwhile attacking the white king. For Geller, the die has been cast. He must accept the rook sacrifice. Queen takes h8. Now, Euwe, of course, follows through with rook c2, invading on this now available c2 square and threatening rook takes g2 check with a decisive attack. At this point, there is only one defensive move to save white, and I encourage you to pause your video and try to find this missed opportunity. Well, the only saving move is the incredible pawn to d5. The key here is to disrupt Black's coordination. Now, there are two ways to capture. The first is queen takes d5, which is easily refuted by rook to e4, which closes off the attack here on g2, and it threatens the knight on e8 and the pawn on g7 if that knight were to move. This is simply overwhelming and suddenly white wins. However, after pawn d5, it is possible to take with the bishop. Bishop takes d5. The key difference between this continuation and the game continuation is that this move blocks the diagonal over here, preventing the queen's invasion, as we will soon see. After bishop takes d5, it looks like the game might be headed to a draw, although things are very complicated, and it's possible for either player to win if the one player overpresses. So rook d1 is the best move, and then after rook takes g2, king over to f1, you can play rook a2. Now, black is down a rook, but the white king is obviously very, very exposed. The best move here is actually bishop to d2 to close off this second rank right here and also to gain time to include the queen. Now, after bishop c4, rook takes, and queen takes c4, the best result seems to likely be a draw after king e1, check, king back, queen check, and the king and the queen are shuffling and you have a perpetual check here. However, in the game, after rook to c2, we see that Geller does not find this incredible move pawn to d5. It doesn't look like it's changing anything, but it would have changed everything. Instead, Geller plays rook to c1, and now after rook takes g2 check, of course you can't move over here and allow the discoveries. Rook takes g3, leading to mate with the bishop attacking the king in the corner. So you instead go king f1, but the difference in this position is that there is no bishop on d5 because you did not sacrifice your pawn, and that allows queen to b3. Suddenly the queen lunges in. Black is down a rook in this position, but in fact white's pieces are totally offside. They have no counterplay against the black king, no checks or anything, and the idea of simply queen f3 check leading to mate or queen to d3 check is too much. There's no way to defend in this position. The game concluded with king e1 and the patient queen to f3. In this position, with the king totally surrounded, facing the attack here from the queen and the rook, white just resigned. An amazing game. I hope that you've enjoyed this game as much as I have over the years. One of my absolute favorite games. It's incredible to see the ideas that exist, not just in attacking play, but in counterattacking play. If you want to see more of my best chess games from the 1950s, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.